In the winter of 1700, the fortress of Narva stood on the edge of collapse. Nearly 40,000 Russian troops had closed in around its walls, turning the frozen countryside into a tightening ring of trenches, artillery, and fire. Inside the city, the defenders were exhausted, badly outnumbered, and running out of time. Every hour made the situation worse. Every Russian cannon shot seemed to bring the fortress one step closer to falling. From any reasonable point of view, Narva looked finished. And then, through the snow, something unexpected appeared. A Swedish relief force, only about 8,000 men strong, marched toward one of the largest armies in northern Europe. It was the kind of move that looked less like a plan and more like desperation. On paper, it made no sense. A smaller army, advancing straight into a siege against an enemy with superior numbers, artillery, and control of the field, should have been crushed before it even got close. But history does not always move according to the numbers. As the Swedish army approached, the weather began to turn. Wind rose across the open ground, and within moments a violent blizzard swept over the battlefield. Snow filled the air so completely that visibility collapsed. Lines disappeared. Commands were lost. Shapes became shadows. What looked like a winter storm was about to become something far more dangerous. Because at that exact moment, the Swedes attacked. What followed at Narva was not just a battlefield upset. It was one of the most shocking reversals in military history, a moment when discipline, timing, and raw nerve allowed 8,000 Swedish soldiers to smash a force 5 times their size. The question is not just how they won. It is how the Russians ever let it happen. By the end of the 17th century, the Baltic Sea was far more than a body of water on the map. It was one of the great commercial highways of northern Europe, a cold, gray corridor through which wealth, influence, and military power moved from one kingdom to another. Ships crossed those waters carrying timber, iron, grain, tar, and weapons, linking the ports of the north to the broader markets of Europe. Whoever controlled the Baltic did not just control trade. They controlled access, leverage, and the ability to shape the future of the region. For years, that advantage belonged to Sweden. What had once been a relatively modest northern kingdom had grown into one of the most formidable powers in Europe. The Swedish Empire held Finland, controlled key stretches of the Baltic coastline, and maintained strong positions in what are now Estonia and Latvia. Its forts guarded strategic ports, its navy protected sea lanes, and its army had built a reputation for discipline and battlefield effectiveness that reached far beyond Scandinavia. In the politics of Northern Europe, Sweden was not simply participating. It was setting the terms. That reality was increasingly frustrating to one man in particular, Tsar Peter I of Russia, later known to history as Peter the Great. Peter understood that Russia's future depended on opening his empire to the wider world. He wanted trade, technology, and stronger ties with Europe, but Russia faced a major strategic problem. It lacked reliable access to the Baltic Sea. Without that access, Russia remained boxed in, commercially limited, and politically disadvantaged compared with the established powers to the west and north. Peter was not content to accept that. He wanted a window to Europe, and to build it, he would have to challenge Sweden's dominance. But Peter also knew Russia could not easily take on Sweden alone. The Swedish military was too experienced, too confident, and too deeply entrenched around the Baltic. So diplomacy became part of the plan. Russia aligned itself with Denmark and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, creating a coalition designed to pressure Sweden from multiple directions at once. The logic was straightforward and ruthless. If Sweden could be forced to fight on several fronts, its strength might be stretched thin enough for its enemies to break through. In that larger strategy, Narva quickly became one of the most important targets. Located near the borderlands between Russian territory and the Baltic coast, Narva was more than just a fortress town. It was a gate. Its strong walls protected one of the key approaches to the sea, and in military terms it stood as a barrier between Russia and the wider Baltic world. If Russia captured Narva, it would gain not only a strategic foothold but also a powerful symbol that Swedish control in the region could be broken. That is why the coming battle mattered so much. Narva was not simply a siege over stone walls and frozen ground. It was the opening test of a much larger struggle over trade, territory, and the balance of power in Northern Europe. What happened there would echo far beyond the battlefield, because both sides understood that Narva represented something larger than itself, the future of the Baltic and who would dominate it. Once the decision for war had been made, Russia moved with the weight of an empire. Orders went out across distant provinces, calling soldiers to muster points from across the vast territory of the Tsar. Men marched in from different regions, some seasoned by previous service, others new to military life, still learning the rhythm of command and discipline. On paper, they were being gathered into a single army. In reality, they were being assembled into something much larger, a demonstration of Russian ambition. Peter the Great was not preparing a border raid or a limited show of force. He was building a campaign meant to break Sweden's hold on the eastern Baltic. That kind of operation required more than manpower. It required equipment, planning, and a huge logistical effort. Blacksmiths worked long hours repairing muskets, sharpening blades, and fitting metal for wagons and artillery teams. Powder stores were packed, ammunition counted, and tools prepared for siege work. Most important of all, Russia began moving the heavy guns needed to reduce a fortress like Narva. These were not light field pieces that could be easily repositioned during a battle. They were massive siege cannons, built to batter stone walls over days or weeks, and each one was a challenge just to transport. Teams of horses strained against the weight while soldiers pushed and guided the wheels through frozen mud, rough roads, and deepening snow. Behind the artillery came the rest of the machinery of war. Long wagon trains carried flour, salted meat, powder, shot, tents, spare weapons, and the endless supplies needed to keep a large army in the field. Officers had to think. Beyond the march itself, tens of thousands of men could not simply arrive outside Narva and begin fighting. They needed food, shelter, ammunition, engineering tools, and a system for replacing what would be consumed, damaged, or lost. In early modern warfare, logistics was often the quiet force that decided whether an army succeeded or collapsed, and the Russian campaign against Narva depended on moving not just soldiers but an entire support network across a brutal winter landscape. When the march finally began, it must have looked overwhelming. Nearly 40,000 Russian troops moved westward through forests, fields, and frozen roads, stretching across the landscape in long columns that seemed to have no end. The artillery rolled behind them. Supply wagons rattled after them. Horse teams struggled forward through mud and snow, while officers tried to maintain order across an army so large that it could not always move at the same pace. From a distance, it would have appeared less like a marching force and more like a slow-moving machine, powerful and relentless, grinding its way toward a single objective. And that objective was Narva. News of the Russian advance traveled ahead of the army itself. Reports reached the fortress from travelers, villagers, and scouts who had seen the columns moving across the winter roads. They described what was coming in plain terms: soldiers, wagons, artillery, and numbers too large to ignore. By the time the Russian army drew near, the message was unmistakable. This was not a probe or a raid. A full-scale siege was coming. Toward Narva now advanced one of the largest military forces in Northern Europe, and with every mile it covered, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. Russia was coming with the size, firepower, and momentum of a state convinced that victory was only a matter of time. Inside Narva, there was no illusion about what was coming. The reports arriving from the east were too consistent and too alarming to dismiss. A massive Russian army was on the move, bringing siege artillery, supply wagons, and enough manpower to overwhelm almost any garrison in the region. The responsibility for holding the fortress fell to the Swedish commander, Colonel Henning Rudolf Horn, and he understood immediately that this was not a situation that allowed for hesitation. Narva stood at one of the most important positions on the eastern edge of Sweden's Baltic world. If it fell, the consequences would reach far beyond the city walls. Horn's first task was brutally simple: make sure the fortress could survive the first shock of the siege. Narva already had strong stone defenses, but strong was not the same as ready. Engineers and soldiers moved quickly along the walls, checking for weak points, repairing damaged sections, and reinforcing vulnerable areas with earth and timber. Gates were inspected, barricades improved, and key defensive positions strengthened in case Russian artillery managed to open breaches. Every section of the fortifications had to be ready to absorb punishment. At the same time, Horn organized the men who would have to hold those defenses under fire. Units were assigned to specific sectors of the walls so there would be no confusion once the attack began. Cannons were moved into position on bastions and towers overlooking the ground where the Russians were expected to approach. Powder and shot were placed nearby so gun crews could reload as fast as possible when the bombardment started. Muskets were cleaned, ammunition distributed, and officers made sure their soldiers understood exactly where they were supposed to stand, fire, and fall back if the pressure increased. In a siege, survival often depended less on heroics than on preparation, and Horn did everything he could to turn preparation into a fighting advantage. The city itself also had to be made ready. Food stores were gathered and counted with care. Grain, dried meat, and salted fish were secured in warehouses to sustain both soldiers and civilians if the siege lasted longer than expected. Wells were checked to ensure reliable water. Blacksmiths repaired weapons and armor, while carpenters strengthened internal defenses that could slow an enemy even if the outer walls were breached. Inside Narva, the work never really stopped. The fortress was becoming a machine built for endurance. Then the Russians arrived. What had first been distant warnings soon became visible reality. From the towers, Swedish lookouts watched dark columns spread across the snow-covered landscape. Soldiers, wagons, horse teams, and great siege guns appeared outside the city in growing numbers until the open ground around Narva seemed to fill with an entire army. Camps were established, fires lit, and officers rode through the lines directing units into place. The Russians were not simply approaching Narva. They were settling in for the systematic destruction of it. Their first move was to close the trap. Russian troops spread out to block the roads leading in and out of the fortress, gradually surrounding Narva on all sides. Engineers began digging trenches into the frozen earth, creating protected positions from which musketeers and artillery crews could operate. The heavy cannons were dragged into firing positions and carefully stabilized with snow and earth packed around their wheels. Everything was being arranged with the cold efficiency of an army that believed time was on its side. Then, one morning, the waiting ended. Russian artillery opened fire, and the siege truly began. Cannonballs slammed into the walls of Narva, throwing stone and debris into the air. Thick smoke rolled over the battlefield as the guns continued firing, their thunder echoing across the winter landscape. The Swedish answered with artillery of their own, and soon the frozen ground between the fortress and the Russian lines became a zone of constant noise, smoke, and impact. Day after day, the bombardment continued. The Russians kept tightening their grip, pushing trenches closer and testing the defenses, while the men inside Narva repaired damage as fast as they could. The siege was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was now a brutal reality, and both sides knew the struggle had only just begun. As the siege dragged on, the struggle for Narva became more than a test of walls and artillery. It became a test of endurance, nerve, and initiative. Colonel Henning Rudolf Horn understood a hard truth that every experienced commander eventually faces in a siege. If his men did nothing but wait behind the fortifications, the Russians would eventually break them down. A larger army with more guns and more manpower could afford patience. The defenders could not. Staying passive might buy time, but it would not change the outcome. So Horn made a decision that gave the garrison its best chance to survive. Instead of merely absorbing pressure, the defenders of Narva would strike back. That choice transformed the character of the fighting. Under cover of darkness, when the wind masked sound and the snow blurred the edges of the battlefield, small groups of Swedish soldiers slipped quietly out of the fortress. They moved low and fast across the frozen ground, navigating terrain they knew better than the men besieging them. Their targets were not random. These raids were aimed at the machinery that made the siege possible, trenches being dug closer to the walls, artillery crews preparing their guns, and supply areas that kept the Russian army functioning day after day. The attacks were sudden, violent, and designed to create confusion. A Russian work party digging in the snow might hear nothing until musket fire exploded at close range. An artillery crew preparing for another round of bombardment could suddenly find itself under assault from men charging with swords and bayonets through the dark. In other cases, the Swedish raiders struck at equipment, damaged guns, burned supplies, or forced Russian soldiers to abandon positions they had spent hours building. Just as quickly as they appeared, the attackers pulled back toward the gates of Narva before larger Russian units could organize an effective response. These operations did not destroy the Russian siege, but they slowed it, disrupted it, and denied the attackers any sense of comfort. The Russians had expected a trapped garrison, not an aggressive one. Each raid reminded them that Narva was not simply waiting to fall. It was fighting back. Russian commanders responded by strengthening night watches, increasing patrols, and trying to secure trenches and camps against surprise attacks. But the battlefield around the fortress was broad, dark, and difficult to control, especially in winter. Snow, wind, smoke, and uneven ground made every movement uncertain. Shadows could mean nothing, or they could mean a Swedish raiding party already closing in. Before long, the siege settled into a punishing rhythm. By day, artillery thundered across the frozen fields as the Russians continued pressing their works closer to the walls. By night, gunfire and sudden clashes erupted in the dark. The snow around Narva, once clean and untouched, became scarred by trenches, craters, blood, and abandoned tools. Men on both sides grew more tired, colder, and more strained with each passing day. Casualties mounted not only from major engagements but from the constant grind of skirmishes, bombardment, exposure, and fear. And still, the Russians believed they held the advantage. They had the numbers, the heavy guns, and the initiative of a siege army tightening its grip. To many Russian officers, the setbacks caused by Swedish raids were irritating, even costly, but not decisive. Time, they believed, remained on their side. So long as the ring around Narva held, the fortress would eventually weaken. Yet that confidence masked a growing problem. The longer the siege continued, the more opportunities there were for momentum to shift, for mistakes to multiply, and for the unexpected to intervene. What looked like a slow Russian victory was becoming a drawn-out contest of attrition, and in wars like that, certainty has a habit of collapsing all at once. While the Russians tightened their grip around Narva, the one thing they did not fully account for was speed. Far from the siege lines, King Charles XII of Sweden was already on the move. He was young, aggressive, and far more willing to gamble than many of his enemies realized. Gathering a relief force of roughly 8,000 men, he marched east through the Baltic winter with a single objective: break the siege before Narva fell. By almost any conventional measure, the odds were absurd. A small Swedish field army was advancing toward an entrenched Russian force of nearly 40,000 backed by artillery and extensive siege works. To outside observers, it looked less like a rescue and more like a march into disaster. The Russians, for their part, were not especially alarmed when reports of Charles's approach reached camp. Their army still outnumbered the Swedes several times over, and they held the ground around Narva. Trenches had been dug, artillery had been placed, and the fortress itself remained under pressure. A smaller enemy force coming straight at them should have been manageable. At worst, many Russian officers likely saw the Swedes as a final nuisance before the inevitable collapse of the city. They had numbers, position, and apparent control. What they lacked, though they did not yet realize it, was flexibility in a moment when conditions were about to change with brutal speed. That moment arrived on November 30th, 1700. As the Swedish army approached the battlefield, the weather turned violently. A powerful snowstorm swept across the open ground around Narva, and the wind blew directly into the Russian lines. Snow filled the air in dense sheets, reducing visibility so badly that soldiers could barely see beyond a short distance. Units lost sight of one another. Officers struggled to communicate. The battlefield itself seemed to disappear into a wall of white. It was exactly the kind of chaos that can paralyze a large army, especially one spread across a broad siege perimeter. Charles XII saw the opportunity immediately and did not hesitate. Instead of waiting for better weather or pausing to reconsider the risks, he ordered an attack. The Swedish army formed into assault columns and advanced straight into the storm. Hidden by the blizzard, they moved far closer to the Russian lines before being clearly detected. What the Russians first experienced was not a clear, organized warning but sudden violence emerging from the snow itself. By the time many of them understood that the Swedes were attacking in force, the enemy was already on top of them. The Swedish assault hit with speed and discipline. This was not a chaotic rush. It was a concentrated strike designed to punch through a much larger army before that army could properly react. Swedish soldiers pushed through the outer trenches, firing muskets at close range and then following with aggressive bayonet and sword attacks. The storm magnified every advantage they had. Russian officers found it difficult to see where the main attack was falling. Units separated by the weather and confusion assumed they were being hit from multiple directions. Orders were delayed, lost, or never understood at all. Once the Russian line began to fracture, the breakdown spread quickly. Trenches and fieldworks that had taken days to build were breached in minutes. Swedish troops drove deeper into the camp, where the geometry of the siege now worked against the Russians. Instead of a secure base of operations, the camp became a maze of tents, wagons, artillery positions, and frightened men trying to make sense of a battlefield they could barely see. Communication collapsed. Resistance became fragmented. Some Russian officers attempted to rally their troops, but isolated pockets of defense could not restore control across such a wide and disordered front. Then the retreat began, and with it came disaster. Large numbers of Russian soldiers fled toward the Narva River, aiming for the narrow bridge behind their positions. In theory, it offered a path to safety. In practice, it became a trap. Men, horses, wagons, and artillery teams surged toward the crossing at the same time, crowding it far beyond its capacity. Under the crushing weight and panic of the retreat, parts of the bridge gave way. Soldiers tumbled into the freezing water. Others were crushed in the press or thrown back into the chaos behind them. What might have been an organized withdrawal turned into a scene of complete panic. As the Russian army disintegrated, the Swedes captured prisoners, seized artillery, and shattered the siege that had threatened to consume Narva. By the time the storm settled and the fighting finally ended, the result was almost unbelievable. An army of 8,000 had broken a force 5 times its size and driven it from the field. The siege was over. Narva had been saved. And in one blinding snowstorm, Charles XII had turned what looked like a desperate relief attempt into one of the most astonishing battlefield victories in military history. When the smoke cleared and the snow settled over Narva, Europe was left staring at one of the most shocking battlefield results of the age. A Swedish army of roughly 8,000 men had shattered a Russian force several times its size and broken a siege that had seemed all but certain to succeed. In the eyes of much of Europe, Charles XII was no longer just a young king. He had become something larger than life, a symbol of fearless command, speed under pressure, and the kind of nerve that can turn impossible odds into history. Narva also proved something timeless about war. Numbers matter, guns matter, position matters. But in the decisive moment, discipline, timing, leadership, and morale can matter just as much. The Swedish victory was not a miracle in the simple sense. It was the result of an army that moved faster, struck harder, and kept its cohesion when the battlefield collapsed into chaos. That is why Narva still feels so dramatic more than 3 centuries later. It reminds us that history does not always belong to the bigger force. Sometimes it belongs to the side that acts with greater clarity when everything is on the line. And yet Narva was not the end of the story. For Peter the Great, the defeat was humiliating, but it was also instructive. He understood that Russia could not compete with Europe's best armies in its current form. So he rebuilt. He reformed the military, improved training, strengthened organization, and turned a painful loss into the beginning of something much larger. In time, that transformation would reshape Northern Europe and challenge Sweden's dominance in ways few could yet imagine. That is part of what makes Narva unforgettable. It was not just an underdog victory. It was a moment that revealed both the peak of Swedish military power and the beginning of Russia's long rise. If you enjoy deep dive history like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with the battle you want to see next, and join us for more stories where one day, one decision, and one battlefield changed the course of history.